everybody. I am a director at Fluxmans, which is one of the oldest commercial law firms in Johannesburg. I'm specifically in the corporate and commercial department. I do a general run of commercial work, including competition work. And that's obviously a large part of that has to do with foreign investment into South Africa and clients looking to expand offshore. And that is my interest, and that's why I've become involved with the Chamber, and it's a pleasure to talk to you all.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. So the aim of this webinar, as I said, is to help businesses and individuals look at expanding into overseas markets, whether it be Singapore to South Africa, South Africa to Singapore. We're going to have this broken down to 3 sections. The first session is really focused on how you need to go about setting up a business in Singapore. And then we will progress into the opposite of that. What do you have to think about when setting up a business in South Africa? And then we'll open it up to Q&A as sort of the ending part of this webinar. So if you have questions, please write it down, keep it to mind, and I'll put it in the chat box. We will aim to answer as much as we can as it pertains to this webinar once we've gone through the sessions. With that, let me start off with session 1, which is how do we and how does a firm and individual think about and directors think about setting up a presence in Singapore. So Andrew, if I can sort of turn to you here, can you just walk us through the key areas that South African businesses, firms, directors should be asking themselves before considering setting up a presence in the country?
Yeah, sure. Like people obviously come into Asia for various reasons. It might be to get access to the marketplace in Singapore and ASEAN or APAC, and they're using it as a starting point. Quite often we see businesses who already have part of their supply chain in this part of the world and want to formalize and professionalize their corporate structure by setting up to have closer corporate bases closer to those suppliers and have more resource dedicated in there. So there can be various reasons for setting up. I think there's a lot of options, and Singapore is often at the forefront of those options. I think because of the corporate governance here and the legal system and the ease of doing business, and that often is attractive for company owners. But importantly, these things are often driven by investors. A lot of the clients we work with are looking to raise equity and get finance to grow their business. And simply put, having a Singapore company gives investors confidence to make subsequent investors into the structure. And 9 times out of 10, that is a big driver for having that base here, perhaps as opposed to other places. So in answer to the question, I'd say, like the initial considerations are like, why are you coming into the region? Being clear about what your intentions are and mapping that out in a business plan, and then thinking about wider aspects like the corporate governance and investors and what their external stakeholders are going to require as well.
Perfect. Moving to you, Ian, if you're a South African business and you're looking to expand overseas, are there any particular points that, from a legal perspective, you need to be mindful of that needs to be covered before they, just start the process of opening a branch office or a headquarters, even for that matter?
Yes, thank you, Manu. There are not a lot of corporate laws that affect this. It's a question of setting up the structure in accordance with whichever foreign jurisdiction you're expanding to. The main South African consideration is our exchange control regulations, which do, I wouldn't say they restrict, but they require certain formalities before investments and funds can be made, can be paid overseas. Any transmission of funds out of the country has to be approved by the Reserve Bank. This can usually be done through your own bank, but the Reserve Bank may require proof that the value that you're paying for is actually fair value for the funds that are being paid. They obviously, the main concern being that they do not want this to be used simply as a vehicle to move funds out of the country without value.
Thank you. Moving on to you, Rex, and then maybe Andrew, you can perhaps follow on if the areas are covered by Rex. Now that the business has taken the decision to expand into Asia using Singapore as a sort of jumping point or headquarters as such, why should Singapore be the country to consider? It's more like a question around, is Singapore the better option of the list of countries, if a firm is looking to expand into Asia?
All right, thanks, Manu. Speaking from a Singaporean's point of view, I think if we see ASEAN as a country, then Singapore probably would be the capital city. So it makes it a natural location to come. I mean, we have been showing off our unique geographical location, that is one. But I think what makes Singapore attractive, I mean, of course, we have our competitors like Malaysia, like Indonesia, like Thailand, which have much bigger population than Singapore. But I think what sets Singapore apart is probably the governance, the transparency, and then, of course, importantly, the corruption index is very low. I mean, we are very transparent how the government works, the business here, the credibility that Singapore firms can actually bring to the table. I think this is what a lot of the foreign MNCs are interested in and they see value in. Andrew has been here for 15 years, so he'll be in a better position to say, why is he here for 15 years instead of, moving to Malaysia, moving to Thailand? So Andrew, maybe you can share a bit on that.
Yeah, it's quite yeah, I think I used to travel a lot in the region, and I think these days, I don't know if it's post-COVID or not, but I don't travel as much now because people are traveling to Singapore, and quite simply, like whether you're dealing with South Africans or any other nationality, there's typically a law firm or an accountancy firm or a professional services firm or even a bank in Singapore that reflects the needs of these people, and people are tripping in here all the time. So it really has become just a hub for globalization and Asian development. I think adding on to the things that you said, which are like essential, is the corporate governance and the low corruption is to start the business. I would add in that Singapore's really invested in digitalization the last 5 years, especially, where not to sort of shame Hong Kong or anything like that, but the difference now between Singapore and Hong Kong in terms of digitalization of the infrastructure is significant. We basically hardly use paper now. So that's been like a big strategy of the Singapore government to do that, to make a tech nation, a smart nation, and they've got the resources and the drive and the political stability to put that through, which is simply impressive. Having been here 15 years, and you see things continuing to go that way. You can see the plan for the next 10 years, and it looks exciting, and it looks like the place to be, and everybody's trying to get into Singapore really to make the most of the opportunities here, and I think that's becoming very clear at the moment.
Perfect. So sticking with you, Andrew, so let's say a company decided to, for all these reasons, set up in Singapore. What are the type of company structures that are on offer in Singapore today? Are there tax benefits of either company structure? And this is a very deep topic, so just the key points would be perfect.
Yeah, well, without going into a lot of detail, there is the whole sort of spectrum of different company structures you would get in most countries, like a rep office and a branch, a partnership, and a private company. But like 99% of our clients do a private limited company. It's easy to set up. It can be done in a couple of days without a lot of headache. It's flexible, and importantly, I think because it's so easy to set up and it's so flexible, the fact that there's two main reasons that make it worthwhile as opposed to setting up a branch, for example. And the first reason is it gives you a tax base in Singapore. So obviously a branch would be simply an extension of your South African company in Singapore. So you'd still be paying full South African tax with a branch. Private company creates a tax base in Singapore, which is typically a little bit lower. And then a liability perspective as well. So a separate entity such as a private company means that if you obviously a lot of foreigners are moving into ASEAN markets and you don't know what's going to happen. So curtailing that liability to with the structure it makes sense. And it doesn't mean that that liability will go back to the parent company as well. So for those two reasons, 99% is a private limited company, but and that's what most of our clients would do.
Staying on that topic, your 15 years here in Singapore, which industries have seen the longest lead time to set up in your experience, or sectors in terms of setting up a presence versus ones that are very quick, or is there no difference?
I think like the lead time, like setting up the company is always quite quick. It depends probably on the licensable. So certain sectors require licenses. For a lot of like financial services companies will require a license. What's been extremely popular in the last 5 years or so is a single family office, for example, where every man and his dog was looking to set up a Singapore office and single family office and move their wealth to Singapore. And simply put, the regulator who had to approve these exemptions and so on was inundated with license applications, so that was taking the lead time was a little bit longer. But yeah, like look, in terms of just setting up a business, if there's no license applications, it's all very quick and efficient to get things up and running.
And could you do everything online or mostly online, or in terms of the submission, or is there some paperwork?
Yeah, like I think most of it's online now. So there's the only thing we need at Sovereign that hasn't been sort of approved locally for digitalization yet is when we set up trusts to hold the shares in companies. Those trust deeds that require to be executed as a deed still require a wet signature. But other than that, the whole corporate side is electronic. There's been a new system that the companies use to register all the details. It's quite progressive.
Fantastic. Moving on to you, Rex. Let's touch a little bit on manpower. So does Singapore have regulations for foreign businesses setting up a presence here in terms of manpower hiring? Are there any requirements to hire local? What has your experience been recently?
Okay, for foreigners coming into Singapore, I mean, let's say, for example, the South African companies that are interested to set up in Singapore and they would like to send their staff from South Africa. There's generally two types of passes. One is what we call the employment pass. How should I put it? The criteria is actually quite simple. It says that the minimum salary to be paid to this staff is $5,600 onwards, but it differs according to the age. As you are older, you actually need to command a higher minimum salary. But in actual fact, if you were to pay somebody $5,600, you will not get your pass approved. The actual qualifying would be somewhere in between $10,000 to about 15,000 Singapore dollars to really get the pass approved. So that is one thing to take note of. And Singapore has moved on to what we call a compass framework, which is a point system. So before you even submit an application, you can do a quick calculation of whether do you even qualify for an employment pass. So it comes down to a few criteria. The foundation criteria will include the basic salary, your qualifications, diversity, as well as the support for local employment. So to qualify, you need about 40 points. And under this foundational criteria, each will give you about 20 points. So you can, mix and match. Of course, there is actually an exemption for the Compass framework is if you're willing to pay your staff at least a minimum of 22,500 Singapore dollars a month, then you need not go through that. So you probably will need to pay a lot more unless you're the owner that's setting up. So coming to the owner that is setting up, we have what we call the entrepreneur pass, the entree pass in short. There's no minimum salary required, but you need to meet two criteria. The first is you need to own at least 30% of the Singapore company that is being set up. That is one. The second is you need to have venture-backed or you own the innovative technologies. So you could be working with government on some innovative projects, or your funding needs to come from capital providers such as the VCs, corporates or family offices. So these are two hard criteria that you need to meet to qualify for entry pass.
And on the pass situation, if let's say you are wanting to set up, I don't know, let's give an example, a logistics firm where you might need to hire less skilled labor or individuals, employees. Is there a special pass for lowly skilled employees?
Oh, yes. In fact, Singapore splits into a few categories. The most basic workers would be what we call under the work permit, followed by a skilled pass and then the employment pass. So under the work permit, those are majority what we call the blue-collar workers. They usually are involved in the construction, and like I said, perhaps into the logistics. So these are the workers, but this will involve what we call local employee ratio. So it again differs from nationalities. So for example, you probably may need to employ 5 Singaporeans to bring in 1 work permit holder. So it depends on nationalities. So again, we need the details before we can advise further.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And look, anyone who's interested in this information, please do contact BIPO and Rexang and work with them and see how you can meet the minimum requirements to set up a proper operational element here. Any pitfalls, Rex, before I go back to Andrew, on that South African companies need to be made aware of in terms of manpower? Not that you've seen historically where a company might have, or companies or clients made mistakes and then had to...
Okay, I think when it comes to applying for the passes, some of the pitfalls to look out for is you do not rush the application, because sometimes you are in a rush to come over to Singapore and you give yourself too short a leeway, So because the Ministry of Manpower will take at least 3 to 8 weeks for processing. So leave ample time for them to do the necessary process and due diligence. So plan your time well. Second thing that will delay the whole application process would be your incomplete or inaccurate documentation, because Singapore requires documentation all in English. So without proper translation and etc., you will not be accepted. So that is another thing. And of course, you're submitting your application without meeting what I shared just now about the Compass framework. You need 40 points to qualify, but you do not meet and you still go ahead. So again, that will derail a lot of the whole process. Discrepancies in information, because maybe due to translation issues. Again, these are things that you need to be a bit more meticulous and look out for. So these are quite minor, but yet significant challenges when it comes to submitting of all these documents, because the Ministry of Manpower actually dig deep into all this.
Perfect. And just for everyone on the call's perspective, for those who are calling in from South Africa, looking to establish a presence here, I can personally vouch for the fact that Singapore is very, very easy to set up a business, but you have to follow the rules. The rules are very clear. They tell you what documentation you have to produce, in what format. you follow it, and it's actually a pretty straightforward process, unlike many other countries you find around the world. But you miss something, there's a discrepancy, it can delay things significantly for you and maybe cause you to restart the process. So be mindful of that for those who are looking to set up a presence here. Going back to Andrew, what do you think are the key regulatory hurdles you've experienced when companies have been trying to set up in Singapore?
Yeah, well, the one I would mention is the requirement to have a local director in Singapore, and it kind of touches a little bit about what the challenges that can sometimes be faced that Rex was mentioning with employment passes and so on, and get it like you know, when businesses are, what we found is when businesses are starting in Singapore, they might not be wanting to send their key guys to Singapore. They might be looking to recruit locally. It could be quite senior hires, but they're people new to the business, or send people across from South Africa or other countries to set up, but they're not sure if these people are going to be director level. And you know, to obviously put somebody as a director on your business, you're moving into a new market and you've got this regulatory requirement to have a local director. So like, of course, most of our companies are happy to put their South African based directors on the board of the Singapore company, which is fine, but it's how to navigate this local director thing, especially if they've not got director people that are resident in Singapore. So that a local resident director, what that means specifically is a Singapore citizen, a Singapore PR, or a foreigner that has this employment pass that Rex mentioned about how to get. So once, if you do have a relevant person that manages to navigate the Compass framework to get in and get the employment pass, then they can certainly be that local director. But there's certainly, that is a regulatory challenge as to, well, how do you, it's a chicken and egg situation, how do you set the company up in the first place if you don't have that person in, and how do you employ someone if you don't have the company? So but thankfully, we do provide support in that service and intermittent services to sit on the board and help work with specialist agencies like Rex's to pull the whole proposition together to navigate that. But that is probably one of the, I think Singapore is one of the few places that has that requirement. There are a couple of other jurisdictions, but it's not many that you need this local Singaporean on the board. You know, other regulatory hurdles are just the appointing a local corporate secretary. That's a requirement, quite not so troublesome, and then you know, just the registered address and need to have the AGM and these sort of corporate matters. But definitely the local director is the one that a lot of our clients need support on.
Right. Rex, just coming back to you, what are your view? I mean, Singapore's been talking a little bit on implementing, in the process of implementing wage requirements. Can you just talk a little bit about what that means and who it affects likely, or who it's likely to affect?
Well, the minimum wage is, of course, something that I guess all companies is concerned about, because indirectly it would increase the manpower costs. So Singapore government has been encouraging a lot on upskilling the workforce. Within Singaporean itself, we have a lot of the credits given by the government in terms of monetary credits to go for courses for upskilling and etc. So for foreign companies that are here, they of course could send their workers for upskilling so that
and these are Singaporeans, right?
Yeah, they can take on more tasks for the upskilling courses. But let's say you are in a situation, an environment whereby majority are non-Singaporeans. The only way to really control the costs, I would say, is investment in technology, investment in automation. So that is something that, again, Singapore is highly encouraging. The other strategy that companies could adopt, flexible workforce. You could keep a smaller pool of full-time employees, keep some on part-time, as well as adopt some flexible, contingent workers, so they can manage your costs. Of course, Singapore government is also aware that this could be a cost. So there's actually a program like what they call the progressive wage credit scheme. So once you are rolling up the minimum wage, etc., you could leverage on this kind of government support, because what they will do is they will co-fund some of the wage increases. So this is some of the things that I guess companies could leverage on government support, go through automation, have a flexible workforce arrangement. So this is the current strategies to combat this potential increase in manpower costs.
Fantastic. Last question for you, Andrew, on this section, which is, you know, with the amount of time you spent with different types of firms from different parts of the world trying to establish a presence in Singapore, is there one or two pitfalls or mistakes you have witnessed when firms have chosen to establish a base or presence, branch, etc., here in Singapore?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything glaring, you know, but there's obviously like some anecdotal stories, you know, like people just getting things wrong. Like I remember one multinational company we were dealing with, they applied for, I think like there's 20 employment passes, and, you know, through an agency like Rex's, and all of them got rejected because the capital in the company wasn't at a sufficient level to warrant it. And I don't think this company had ever been rejected on something like this in their life. So, you know, immediately a lot of, let's say, a lot of money came in quite swiftly to rectify that. So just making sure, like, I think, you know, having advice to cover accounts, legal, immigration, and general business, because I think it's bringing all of these things together. And sometimes, you know, it's getting a sort of firm that can help you with all of those things collectively to keep on top of things. You know, I'd say there's the one thing potentially to watch just now is like as a tax thing, and I would say it's potentially a future pitfall. So it's not one that's really came to light just now, but certainly should be something that's considering foreigners that are setting up in Singapore. Is this you know, like if a Singapore company holds offshore assets and sells those assets, historically there was no well, there still is no capital gains tax in Singapore. So and a lot of people would go along that principle, but now you know, there's this new tax code called Section 10L that needs to be carefully considered with relating to substance in Singapore. So how much operational base is here, and potentially Section 10L can be activated if it's deemed that there's not enough substance in the Singapore entity, which can trigger a tax liability potentially in Singapore. So under that, which is equivalent to corporate tax. So I think that's one I would watch, and something that can be planned around, and advice can be given around this to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think that would be my main pitfall at the moment, Manu, for any new foreigners looking to make a footprint in the region and investment into subsidiaries that may be sold in the future. You know, a lot of people are investing in Singapore and setting up in Australia, setting up in Indonesia, Vietnam, and then selling off those 6 subsidiaries. So the last thing you'd want is a super successful subsidiary, you know, and then bringing that money back up to Singapore and finding that you thought it was going to be tax-free, but might not be because of this tweak in the tax code. So that would be the big pitfall.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Look, everyone who's been finding this, I hope you've been finding these engagement on various topics, from manpower to legal setup to areas challenges that you might face, not put you off. These are the minor things compared to other countries that Singapore does bring to the table. However, having said that, it's always useful to have partners like BIPO and Sovereign to help guide you through this process. It makes it easier. And so please do, you know, after the call, we will send out their details. Please do reach out to them for more advice and see how you can engage with them on establishing a presence in the country. Moving on to our next session now, we're going to change it and put it on, turn it around and say, let's now talk to firms that are perhaps looking at expanding beyond Asia, looking at opportunities, you know, in what is a very, very blessed continent, Africa. South Africa, you know, offers a lot of opportunities to expand one's territory, get new clients, drive new engagement, build a presence in what is still a nascent continent in by some regards, and some regards very forward-thinking. So let's talk a little bit about setting up a business in South Africa. Going to Ian now. So Ian's been patiently waiting to share his input. What do you think, if you're a Singaporean company or any other foreign company for that matter, looking to establish a presence in South Africa, what do you think the best structures in terms of establishing a business in South Africa? What would you suggest?
Well, there are two principal ways that overseas investors come into South Africa. One is to establish a company in South Africa. There is no restriction on overseas shareholding. There's no restriction on overseas directors. And so it's quite easy to establish a company in South Africa. Obviously, you can also then invest or acquire an existing business. Again, there's no requirement for a minimum ownership by locals. That's sort of coming on to the next question, but so there's really those are the most common ways. That there's also, our company law also does allow a foreign company to actually trade in South Africa in its own right, to open an office in South Africa in its own name, but it would then have to still register with the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, which the CIPC, as an external company. So it is on record as an external company as soon as it does formally start conducting any business, enter into transactions, employ people, etc.
Thank you. And everyone, we're going to stick with Ian for a bit on this. So Ian, I hope you've got a glass of water there.
I do.
Are there any rules regarding local ownership that firms have to be mindful
As I
of?
mentioned, there are no rules, general rules on local ownership, but we do have certain laws which are intended to redress the injustices under apartheid, which require that if you want to enter into certain transactions, particularly if you want to enter into transactions with government, or you require a permit to conduct specific businesses such as mining or banking, you then might have to comply in terms of that legislation with what they call a scorecard. So it's not automatically foreign ownership. There's a combination of various factors such as foreign ownership, local ownership, local management, and investment in social upliftment programs in South Africa, commitments to use the services of local suppliers. All of these are, you get a score for your compliance in each one of these categories, and you have to achieve a minimum score if you want to do business with government or get certain permits.
That's good to know. So everyone, there are things that you have to consider, and definitely it's pretty straightforward, but still there are areas that might not be stuff that you've come across, having done business in Singapore, that you need to be aware of, when engaging with when it comes to ownership issues. On that point, or maybe a related point, is there any requirement from the Reserve Bank, and maybe this is not the right question perhaps for you, but just to say, in terms of a minimum capital deployment requirements or keeping money in the country, can it be left in Singapore and then transferred as needs be, or has to be a lump sum that has to be put into the country, given the fact that South Africa has exchange controls, unlike Singapore?
Yeah, there's no minimum investment requirement. The exchange control applies more to outflow of money.
Okay.
So if you have advanced money in the form of a loan, if you wish to repatriate dividends, etc., then you will require, and you want to repay the loan or expatriate dividends, then you will require Reserve Bank approval. And what the Reserve Bank requires is actually, if you acquire equity in a South African company, whether it's your own company that you've established or whether you're buying shares in an existing South African company, the share certificate issued to the foreign shareholder actually has to be endorsed as a non-resident share by the Reserve Bank. And if that is not done, there can be quite a lot of hoops that you'll have to jump through if you want to expatriate those funds at a later stage.
Okay. And there's no limits to how many times you can repatriate dividends as long as the Reserve Bank approves or has a visibility of how you want to do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. You think about laws and regulations. What do you think about, could you talk a little bit about intellectual property rights and protection in South Africa, especially compared perhaps to some of the other jurisdictions you might know about? We don't have to talk about every country. We don't have to talk about Singapore necessarily, but what happens if I'm a Singapore company with some special IP and I bring it to South Africa? What are my rights and what can I protect in case someone decides to run away with it or copy it?
Yes, South Africa is a party to virtually all of the international intellectual property treaties. So our intellectual property is aligned with most countries in the world that are members of these treaties. We protect trademarks, copyright, patents, designs. They're all protected in South Africa. Our trademark law even protects unregistered foreign trademarks that have become well known in South Africa due to their global presence generally. So we have a very sophisticated system. Our courts, at least on that side of things, our courts are still very efficient. We have certain specialist judges who understand this law. So I would say our intellectual property system is on a par with anywhere.
Now, changing the tables around a little bit. I mean, Ian, we can start with you, and Andrew, if you have any additions, you can please feel free to jump in here. Are there any residency requirements? Singapore has certain requirements in terms of hiring a local director, employees who are local, as you've heard from Rex and Andrew. Is that the same in South Africa, or are there totally different rules that need to be followed on that basis?
Again, South Africa doesn't have any minimum requirement in terms of hiring locals. If one is talking about setting up a large, the immigration laws, if a foreign executive, if the company wants to transfer employees from foreign branches into South Africa, those people will have to acquire residence and work permits in South Africa. The main criterion that would be applied in deciding whether to issue those is whether there are South Africans who are qualified to perform that function. And depending on how sort of high up the corporate ladder you go, those criteria are applied in different ways. So if you're talking about blue-collar employees, they would be quite strict in issuing those. You'd have to show that these people are technicians that have skills that really are not available in South Africa. You might have to give an undertaking that those people would train up South Africans ultimately to replace them. As you go higher up the executive ladder, where you've got the directors of the company who are intimately involved in running the company, they'd be less strict in applying those criteria.
Very useful to know. Last question from us before we open it up for Q&A is, Singapore is known to be quite low in terms of tax rates. What tax rules do you think would apply to foreign companies controlled by South Africans? So this is more of the outbound question, outbound
Yes.
South Africa into Singapore.
Yes, so there is a concept of a controlled foreign company. So where a South African tax resident owns more than 50% of a foreign company, they are liable for the income earned and capital gains arising from that company in South Africa. There are certain exemptions. For example, if there's a double taxation agreement in place and the South African party is already paying tax in the foreign jurisdiction, or if the controlled foreign company has a substantial offshore presence. So one's got, but those laws are quite complicated and difficult to go into detail here in this forum, but that is something that needs to be considered.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. We've sort of hit the 4:52 mark, Singapore time. And so we'll open it up to questions. And first of all, I want to thank everyone here on the call who managed to join in, and obviously our presenters and Carradine for setting this up. So when you think about, so you've got one question here, and I open it up to the floor. Anyone of the presenters can answer this. If maybe it's Andrew really, and then Rex, you can join in, or perhaps the other way around, because Rex, you work for Enterprise Singapore. So what do you think are the key sectors in Singapore that present the most opportunities for foreign businesses? Where are areas that you see gaps that allow perhaps firms, so foreign businesses, South African firms in particular, perhaps to differentiate and do something special about what they're doing in Singapore? Because Singapore is not necessarily targeting every sector. There's a big emphasis and focus on particular types of sectors. So it's a broadish question, but perhaps something that you might have noticed or come across where there seems to be a gap.
Yeah, well, I could share a little bit about my experience, at least. I think in terms of sector analysis and where the opportunities lie in Singapore, I think first of all, I say Singapore has been so successful because it really has its finger in so many pies. It's basically promoted, from logistics to mining to commodities to tech to it's really, the government's done so well in supporting the infrastructure and development of all these sectors. It's just insane as to so there's opportunities everywhere. Relative to our clients and where they've had some success is, we see a lot of tech companies, like tech in South Africa, a lot of smart people that have got a lot of tech that's done well in the African region, and they're looking to try and expand that into outside into Asia, and then one of the things, so a little bit of a plug for the chamber. I've recently joined. It was our Cape Town office that put me in touch, and at the last event I was at, I was quite impressed by the fact that there's a couple of CTOs as part of the chamber, and they were very encouraging that they personally wanted to get involved as their mission with South African businesses that were in the tech space to help them move in globally and into Asia through the South African Chamber. So I thought that was really nice that was being offered as a service, and I think there's a huge opportunity for that type of tech to come in and be supported in Singapore.
Great. Rex, what do you think?
Adding on to what Andrew just shared, indeed, the tech sector is one area that the Singapore government is actively trying to attract more talent in. In fact, we were talking about the employment pass. There is actually a bonus points criteria if you are having innovative platforms, technologies, you have higher skill set. That itself is a criteria that you could use to gain bonus points for the Compass framework. That is one. Singapore has got its Smart Nation 2.0 rolled out. Again, the government is not restricting itself to just Singapore companies or Singaporean-owned companies participating in it, because we simply do not have enough. So it's open to the world. So these are opportunities that I think South African companies can take advantage of and see how they can value add or contribute to these sectors.
Manu, you're
muted.
Thank you. Still do this. There is a question around, well, two questions that have come up. One is about the corporate and personal tax, difference between South Africa and Singapore. And any comments on that Ian, Andrew, you want to provide? And the second part is cost of living difference. I can tell you now, I think that's a very simple answer. South Africa is cheaper from a cost of living perspective than Singapore. And so the difference can be huge depending on what type of activities you want to engage in. So it's all a function of what you as an individual and the type of sectors your company might be engaged in. It can be, if it's from a corporate perspective, you're engaging in an area which has a dearth of suppliers or a dearth of employment opportunities to hire employees locally, then obviously the costs significantly ramp up for that business to try and establish themselves here. And these are just ongoing costs like wage costs and so on. And obviously Singapore is on a higher development scale. Mercer's provides information about this, and you can get in touch with someone there, as well as Sovereign, to help you discuss this going forward. But just to comment on the tax and corporate tax and personal tax, it is individual specific, but I'll just maybe have Andrew and Ian just comment a little bit on this.
Like the personal tax is probably the easy one to like a lot of people ask about this, and like if you're a foreigner coming to Singapore and you're a resident here, then you would be on the progressive scale of taxes depending on how much you earn, which starts in single digits and goes up to about 20%. But it's, you have to be earning quite a lot, quite a high salary to be at that level. Like I think most people are typically around the 10-15% mark. If you're a non-resident, so you can still get this employment pass, which Rex mentioned on the Compass framework, but you don't have to be resident. Remember, this pass isn't a residency pass per se. It's just a permission and an ability to work in Singapore. And you can do that whether you're 183 days or not. The usual residency test would deem as to whether you're a resident. So if you're non-resident but on an EP, then you would be liable to a flat rate of 15% tax, regardless of how much you earn. So that's the taxes you might pay as a personal on personal tax. The corporate tax is 17%, and there's some partial exemptions, which on the first 200,000 of profit, Singapore dollars, which lowers that slightly. But I think again, we're just touching the bases here on the seminar, but the big thing that people need to get their head around is the basis of the tax in Singapore, which is quite different from a lot of places. It's called source and remittance. So it's not so Singapore companies aren't necessarily taxed on their worldwide income. I'm not sure if that's the case in South Africa or not, but in Singapore, really, it's just did the activity happen in Singapore? As one question, and the second question is, are you remitting the profits from that activity into Singapore? as the second. So arguably, if a company's involved in activities and those activities there's no connection to Singapore, and you don't bring the money into Singapore, then arguably it might not even have to pay tax here on that. So some planning can sometimes be done around that, and this is something that's quite new for a lot of foreigners and international people who are just basically used to a company being liable for tax on its global revenue. So yeah, that's something quite unique.
So Ian, very quickly, can you comment on just the tax rates, and then we will have to end off here as we're kind of running out of time.
Yes, thanks, Manu. So, like in Singapore, our personal individual income tax is on a sliding scale. The highest rate is 45%. And then corporate tax is at a rate of 27% on company profits. And then there's a tax on dividends declared by a company, which is deductible by the company before payment of dividends, and that is at the rate of 20% on those dividends. So obviously, if you are a shareholder and an employee of the company, you may want to structure your returns from the company in such a way that you're maximizing the tax benefits in terms of dividends as opposed to salary.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone who's still around and for joining this. I want to really give a shout out to Ian, Rex, Andrew, and Carolyn for fantastic effort in setting up this webinar and dealing with the challenges that people might face when looking at either country. I would like to remind everyone, Rex, Ian, and Andrew are available to discuss your particular situation and try and provide you with what I think would be fantastic advice on how to go about establishing a presence in either country. So thank you again. We will be in touch in the next few months on other interesting topics, perhaps an in-person event or via webinar. Carolyn will make sure that you're aware of it. Thank you and have a fantastic week, and look forward to engaging in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and see you around.